Hi, this is Andrew from Jonesy's. I'm once again working on this 2002 Dodge Caravan, and the complaint here is that we had a couple hot days and my van is not blowing cold air. So we kind of looked at it. We found that the system was empty, so obviously he has a leak somewhere. Well, luckily the shop that previously recharged the air conditioning system put dye in there. They use dye inside the oil and it fluoresces under ultraviolet light. So if you happen to have an ultraviolet light, then you start looking around at any fittings or anything, and we eventually found that this little crimped in fitting that goes directly into the condenser manifold is fluorescing a kind of bright green color, which means it's leaking at that point, and that's a non-serviceable part. The condenser has to be replaced. So to do this, we started off by first removing the upper and lower valences. Those are held in by simple little plastic clips and very easy to remove. The bottom one will give us access to the bottom bolts of the condenser, and the top valence removed will give us access to the top bolts on the condenser. And you will see, here's our replacement condenser, that there is 4 mounting points on each of the corners. And so now we're just going to have to get into our condenser, start removing those 4 screws, and then we will also need to remove the lines going into our manifold on the condenser itself. Now, this point right here, this is where our leak is. So that's kind of a reference for you as to where it's actually leaking at. One last thing to note is that if you were going to do this yourself, in the event that your air conditioning system is not fully purged, you'll need to take it to a service shop and have a technician remove the refrigerant first. Okay, so now for removing this condenser, the 2 bottom side bolts that mount it are very easy to get to from the bottom. The 2 top bolts on the sides that mount it are very easy to get to. The problem is there's 2 nuts on studs, and they are a 13mm nut, and we need to get those off, but they're hard to get to. So to remedy this, the configuration I'm going to use is about a 8-inch long extension with a universal and my socket. The problem with that is, as you can see, this thing's rather flaccid, and it's going to make it really difficult to get it inserted on there. So to remedy that, I'm going to use just a little piece of masking tape. I'm going to wrap it around the universal joint, like so, and now you'll see that it's still flexible, however it holds it in place, and it's nice and firm. So, the trick to getting these is that once you remove that top valence, this bumper's loose now. So I'm going to go in from the top, I'm going to bring it down past the headlight, we're going to just slip it right in there, and then get it onto the nut. Which is still slightly tricky, but there you go. There's one, and there's 2 of them holding them on there, so now I need to get the other guy. Okay, I've gotten those lines removed off the side of the manifold, and I've removed all the mounting bolts. So now, as you can see, this condenser is completely loose, but it's locked in by the side mounting brackets. I'm going to choose to undo the driver's side one because there's only 2 bolts versus 3 on the other side. This bracket also mounts the tranny cooler, so there's a bolt that goes in this way about 4 inches down, and then there's another bolt right here. So we'll remove the one going into the tranny cooler by the same technique I removed the lines with. We'll just get in there, get on it, and we'll pull that one out, and then we'll remove this top one, and that should make this loose enough now to pull that bracket out of the way and allow the condenser to come out. Alright, we'll see if it's fully loose now. Looks like I can move this side, and I think I can pull it free enough to pull it out. Okay, I tried to remove the condenser without having to undo this mounting bracket on this side. However, that didn't work. So I ended up removing the top bolt on this side, which allows this whole thing to pivot freely because we already undid the tranny cooler on the other side, so you can move it back and forth just by removing that one bolt. Now that that's done, I got plenty of room to just start working the condenser out of here. And so you're just going to have to carefully keep working at it until eventually you get it to pop free and get enough room to get it out of there. There we go. Now, this one, getting it out isn't too big a deal. It's putting the new one in that you have to be extremely careful, as you do not want to puncture it. Okay, to put the condenser back in, I chose to go ahead and remove the hood latch off of here. It's two 10mm headed bolts. It makes life a lot easier. It doesn't fight you near as much. Before you put the new one in though, make sure and remove the two studs that are in the old condenser that mount the lines going in. And you can see those down inside there, the nuts go onto them. Okay, so I just basically carefully slid this back down in there. It's a bit of a Rubik's Cube, but as long as you're careful, you shouldn't damage anything. Slid it down in, got the mounts for the condenser placed back in. They have little rubber isolators at the bottom. Poke those back in there, and then put in the screws into the condenser to go ahead and stiffen everything back up. And then now the only thing left to do is go back through and put all the various screws back where I removed them from. Okay, now that I've finished my condenser install, I need to recharge the system with refrigerant. So to do that, the very first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to draw a vacuum on the system. So if you're not familiar with this at all, you have to get all your contaminants out, which is your moistures, and you need to get anything that's not refrigerant, i.e. air, out of the system, or it will not work. So to do that, I've hooked up my gauge set, and then I connected that to this Venturi style vacuum pump. This draws a close to a perfect vacuum, but not that close. So when you do that, you're going to have to let it draw on there for at least half an hour. And the reason why is the compressor oils that are inside the lines will absorb moisture. To get that moisture out, it has to boil out under a vacuum. So it's going to take some time for that to happen. So once you've drawn your vacuum for at least half an hour, you'll see it draw down into this green section in the gauge. Then we let it run for at least about an hour. Then we shut off all the valves and we let it sit for at least an hour to make sure that we don't have a leak in the system, and as you can see, it's still holding vacuum. Thus, we don't have any leaks. So now, we're ready to actually charge the system with refrigerant. We don't need to add any additional oil because we never removed any oil out of the system, and there's very little in the condenser. So, to do this, I've gone ahead and hooked up to my refrigerant jug. This is R134A. So what I like to do is I like to put a partial charge in the system, just add a little bit. Then I go up, start up the engine, turn on the air conditioning to its maximum settings, maximum fan, maximum coldness. And then as I'm running it, I'll start adding refrigerant. There's two ways to measure how much refrigerant you add to the system. One way is sometimes on the vehicle there'll be a placard that will actually tell you how much refrigerant in ounces or pounds that you need to add to the system. You put your refrigerant jug on a scale, and then you start adding refrigerant, and as the weight drops in the scale, you know how much weight in ounces you're adding to the system. This, I couldn't find it, and we use the down and dirty Dodge Caravan method here, which is we go 100 psi on the high side above ambient temperature. This is your low side gauge, this is for the vapor side. This is your high side gauge, this is for the liquid refrigerant side. And what you're going to do is add refrigerant till this goes 100 above ambient temperature. Right now it's about 70 degrees out, so I'm looking for about 170 psi. So we'll go ahead and add our partial charge at this point. And we'll just watch this side till we add a reasonable amount. And we got about 20 pounds there on the low side. I'm looking for about 25 and 25. That's pretty close. That's a little under 20, but that's good enough to start this up with. Okay, now I've started up the engine. Everything's running on max. I'm ready to start adding refrigerant. Now one thing I've done is I've flipped my jug over at this point. This will add liquid instead of vapor, which is a quicker method of filling. It also keeps the jug from icing up. Now when I add refrigerant, I always add to the low side rather than the high side. And the reason why is when the compressor starts compressing, it's going to ramp up this pressure above what's in the tank that I'm trying to add refrigerant from. So it'll start refilling the tank, which I do not want. So I always want to go to the low side, which is at a lower pressure than the supply tank. We're going to open this. We'll start adding some. And then I'm going to close it off, let it balance out a little bit. I'll add some more. And there you can hear the compressor just kicked in, which means that it's at a high enough pressure that it's no longer cut off by the low pressure cutout switch. Alright, we'll let it stabilize. Now you can see how fast that drops. It's going into a vacuum, which we don't want. It's actually hard on these compressors to draw a vacuum. They're not designed for that. They're designed to run in about a 20 psi range or so. And you can see our high side's coming up now consistently. Okay, we'll let it balance out again and see what it's doing. Now you can see we're at about 10 psi on the low side, and looks like about 130 on the high side, and still going up just slightly. So we just want to see where that goes to before we keep adding refrigerant. You'll notice there we're going above 150, about 160. It looks like we're going to hit pretty much where we want to be. Alright, so I'm going to let this run for a little bit, and then I'll go ahead and run the RPMs up a little, and then I'm going to go inside, check the temperature, and see if we're actually cooling.